All right, guys, Mrs. Palmer here again. I promised you part of this series on the Enlightenment, and so I just want to make a few general comments about some of the art of the time period. I am not an expert in art, and if you want to know more about it, you can do some research on your own, or you can talk to Mrs. Carr, who teaches AP Art History. But I just want to give you kind of a little bit of a glimpse in case you encounter some of this stuff on the AP exam or, I don't know, elsewhere in life. Just some general comments. Of course, we've said this before, but neo just means new. So this word neo just means new. Neoclassical art, you can kind of guess what it's about. It is sort of reviving Greco-Roman art. So it had a lot of themes from Greek and Roman civilization. It stressed the simplicity and the dignity of art, or the art of ancient Greece and Rome. It had a moral seriousness in terms of its subject matter, and often an emphasis on things like honor and patriotism. Some famous examples of neoclassical art would include the work of Jacques-Louis David, and this one I believe is in the AP textbook, and it's called the Oath of Horatii. It was done in 1784, and you can see it at the Louvre Museum in Paris. Chloe Rose and I got to see this a while back, and that was kind of neat. I'm not sure, Chloe, if you got to see this painting in particular, but it was there. Another famous one is this Joffre, I guess. I don't know how to say those. Again, there's my fake French accent. Cleopatra and Octavian. This is in the National Gallery in Scotland. Another popular form of art during this time period, in the 18th century, was Baroque. And you can see some Baroque architecture here. This stressed majesty, power, movement. As you can see, the architecture is kind of heavy, very elaborate. Maybe some of us would describe it as a bit gaudy. And so these are very popular churches, were designed by a man named Balthasar Neumann. And again, this building had sculptural figures and wall and ceiling paintings blended into the harmonious whole. It was often used in palaces and in churches, and so here is just one example. And this painting in the upper part of the slide is kind of a Baroque Rococo style painting, and then inside or below it are to the interior of the churches designed by Neumann. So although the Baroque and neoclassical art of the 17th century continued into the 18th century, by the 1730s, so the early 18th century, another new style overlapped with it, and it was called Rococo. So learn to pronounce that. You put the emphasis on the first syllable, Rococo. Stressed grace and gentle action, and it rejected the strict geometrical patterns of maybe neoclassical art, for example. The characteristics of the subject matter were almost always secular themes, sort of showed this lightness and charm, very worldly pleasure, the pursuit of pleasure and happiness in this world, often sensual, and often the subjects were upper class people, so aristocrats. But underneath it all, this art was meant to reveal the delicate nature of life and all of these things. A couple examples would be The Lesson of Love by Jean-Antoine Watteau, and La Déjeuner, I guess, The Breakfast by Francois Boucher. And so you might recognize those if they show up on a test or just somewhere, or if you happen to travel, you can impress people with your knowledge of Rococo art. Slide, you can see a bit of the interior of the famous Palace of Versailles built by Louis XIV. Again, Chloe Rose and I got to see this live on our trip in, I think it was 2018. It was quite amazing. It was probably the highlight of my trip. So you need to get to Versailles, which is just outside of Paris, to see this incredible place. In terms of music, the 17th and 18th centuries were very important years in terms of classical music. Italians during this time developed the opera, the oratorio, the sonata, the concerto, and the symphony. And musicians at this time were patronized by the wealthy. A couple of the most famous musicians of this time, of course, were Bach and Handel, who were considered geniuses. Bach was actually a devout Christian who said that he composed his music to glorify God. Handel was more secular, but ironically developed the famous oratorio known. Perhaps he glorified God without even intending to. Haydn and Mozart, also very, very important figures during this time, and this moves Europe out of the Baroque classical era into the new classical era, like actually the name classical era. And the center of this great music shifts from Italy, which kind of had the initial was the initial hub of this great music, to the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and to Germany. So you probably have heard about Mozart. He was a child prodigy, gave his first harpsichord concert at 6 years old, and wrote his first opera at 12, then wrote many famous operas, including The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and The Magic Flute. Some literature also begins to shift in the 18th century when the novel becomes more developed. Let's just say Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding are two famous authors from this time period. And then more up my alley, the field of history changed a lot, the Enlightenment, under the philosophers. History had been written really more as a commentary on providence and God's working in the world over time. And history began to shift, as you would imagine, just based on what you know about the philosophers, became more secular and started to concentrate more on the events themselves without trying to explain the why, trying to explain events in history without reference to God. And this also initiated the emergence of something called social history, which is about everyday people like you and me, not just political history. So a lot of times what you read in textbooks is more political history. It tells you about this president or that president or this dictator, but social history gets more at what was life like for regular people during a particular time period. The history of the Middle Ages was written by those who hated it. And so the people who thought it was the worst time in the world, of course, named it the Dark Ages. And we've talked about that before. And then finally, a man named Edward Gibbon was a very famous historian, wrote a very famous historical work called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he is the one who was the first one to make the claim that Rome fell because it became fundamentally Christian. So as the Christian church began to be accepted in the Roman Empire, as when Christians stopped being persecuted, and when Rome officially began to adopt the Christian faith, it weakened because of the values of Christianity that talk about humility and love and gentleness and being meek. And so Gibbon's argument is it softened the Romans and they could not stand against those who were trying to invade, aka the barbarians. And then just a few more points. High culture, when you hear the word high culture, that just refers to kind of the literature, art, and music of the upper classes, the wealthy, the educated, and this kind of has maybe a snobby connotation. The elite thinkers met in salons. People with a lot of money met in salons, often hosted by women, and they also met in universities and academies and liked to talk a lot. And they were more into the world of poetry, tended to see themselves as intellectuals, philosophers, scientists, theologians, and dramatists. And Latin was still an important language among the elites, and I think it was mainly because it was not known by the commoners, and so it was sort of a way to stay above them in society, or at least to believe that they were above them. Low or pop culture, on the other hand, is kind of like the culture of the majority of people, right? Not the 1% or the 3%, but common people, everyone from kind of really poor people all the way up through the middle classes. But during this time, there was a growth of publishing houses, made more reading available to the general public. They had magazines and newspapers, daily newspapers that were actually provided for free in coffee houses so people could read about daily events. They had festivals. The most famous one was called the Carnival, and people would drink a lot and sing folk songs and, just have a good old time. But during this time, the 18th century, there was a widening gap between the rich and the poor. As you can tell, the rich did things like, converse in salons over philosophy and go to classical concerts, maybe performed by Mozart. But the common folk did more like drink beer with a bunch of people or sit in a coffee house or, gather with their friends at the carnival. But some things like urban fairs brought people together. So sometimes you would get more of a mixing of classes. Chapbooks were a form of popular literature. They were kind of short brochures sold by itinerant peddlers, meaning people that kind of had little wagons that they pushed and went from town to town to sell to people, to the lower classes in particular. Some of the stories were inspirational. Some of them were kind of not very kosher, not very nice. Some were adventure stories. And so as we have talked about, even with the Renaissance, literacy rates started or just continued to increase during this time. And primary education, that is education through maybe, fourth grade, fifth grade, became much more frequent and common in Europe thanks to mainly Protestantism. And you can think about why would Protestants want to have really good schools and to educate people so they could read the Bible, right, and for themselves. Secondary schools then were often run by the churches and were somewhat elitist. They tended to, even though maybe you would think that having all these schools that were put on by churches would make more people literate and thus able to kind of climb up the social ladder, it actually reinforced the class system because part of what these schools promoted was concentrating on the classics and sort of these lofty ideas versus just a regular practical education, like how do you get a job so you can make money and feed your family kind of thing. The philosophers wanted to reform the system very much. Universities were still kind of buried in the old way of doing things, still buried in the classes, but even this began to change by the end of the 18th century. And then finally, in the 18th century, there were new advances in medicine that started a little earlier, and we talked about especially during the scientific revolution. But the new methods focused on clinical experience. So don't just read a book and think hypothetically, but do things, learn how to actually examine people, that kind of thing. So below physicians were surgeons, still known as barber surgeons, because they still use crude methods like bleeding people with leeches. But surgeons started to separate themselves from barbers in the 1740s and started to become more specialized and better trained. They started to imagine that, study anatomy and dissect corpses and learn about the human body, imagine that, before cutting you. So interestingly enough, now we think of surgeons as kind of like the top, that which is kind of scary thought. You go to someone to cut your hair and they don't know what they're doing, but they figure they're just going to cut you open anyway. The Royal College of Surgeons in England required clinical experience before licensing their surgeons. And then also at the same time, apothecaries, which were like early pharmacists, and midwives also did their thing, especially in terms of delivering babies for the poor. So midwives were generally used for the poor, whereas doctors were used for those of means. And doggone it, I know I promised you this would be the last one, but I am going to have to talk to you, probably in person, about some of the changes that were going on in the church, how the Enlightenment affected church teaching, as well as how it affected minorities like the Jews in Europe at this time. So that is kind of interesting, and we'll save that for a bit later, but you're done for now.